Flashman at the Charge by George Macdonald Fraser, book review. So, having read Tom Brown's School Days, Flashman, Royal Flash, and Flash for Freedom, I now come to the fourth book in the Flashman series. Now, the reason I got into these Flashman books in the first place, as I mentioned in my review of the first Flashman book, is because I was interested in the 19th century rivalry between Britain and Russia over Afghanistan and Central Asia. This book returns to that theme, although like the previous books, it has Flashmen rushing from one danger spot into another. So it manages to cover a lot of diverse ground. The first third of the book deals with the Crimean War. Now, the Crimean War is when the Cold War between Britain and Russia in the 19th century momentarily turned into an actual hot war. Then the middle of the book deals with Russia and the serfdom problem. And then the last third of the book goes south to Central Asia and back into Afghanistan. As always, Flashman manages to be present at all the great historical battles. And as always, he's present against his will. The first third of the book, dealing with the Crimean War, is very well researched, very well written, and brings to life many of the historical characters involved in the conflict. From William Howard Russell, who was the Times correspondent, who Flashman finds annoying, to Francis Duberly, who Flashman is always trying to get into bed. The Crimean War is viewed through the hindsight of history, a pointless war, as almost all wars are viewed through hindsight. Two empires were battling each other for strategic positioning in the East, and for this, thousands of men on both sides were asked to throw their lives away. Of course, that's not how it was sold to the British public at the time. At the time, they were told they were fighting for freedom and protecting Turkey against unfair aggression. Flashman, although a bully and a coward, and thoroughly lacking in any redeeming features, is oddly enough the perfect narrator to see right through the Victorian hypocrisy. He realizes that even though he's only ever cared for himself, he has never been guilty of sending off thousands of men to their deaths. In his own way, he figures he is actually less harmful than the army generals obsessed with honor and duty to country. And the scary thing is, he's right. Now, the mismanagement which permeated the whole Crimean War has always been symbolically represented in the charge of the Light Brigade. And sure enough, Flashman finds himself dragged into the charge of the Light Brigade, against his will, of course. Now, I'm an American, so for most of my life I had no idea what the charge of the Light Brigade was. I mean, I knew it was something famous that was connected to some poem or something, but I never knew the details. A few years ago, I did find an interesting BBC radio program, In Our Time, which does an interesting episode on the charge of the Light Brigade. I'll link to it down below if you're interested, and yes, it is interesting. And so after having listened to that a few years ago, I vaguely knew the main part of the charge of the Light Brigade. I knew it was an incident in which they had charged the wrong guns. But I had a hard time keeping straight in my mind exactly how the communication broke down. I mean, they do go into it in the radio program, but I just couldn't keep it straight in my mind. I couldn't remember it. This is the advantage of historical fiction. I mean, even though, yes, it is fictionalized slightly, by putting this into the context of a novel, and by walking you through step by step, making it into a story, it makes it much easier to follow and much easier to remember. So this book walks you through, step by step, the whole disastrous chain of events that led to the charge of the Light Brigade. The faceless historical names become characters in the novel with real personalities. The author, George Macdonald Fraser, faithfully reproduces much of the petty squabbling and personality conflicts that took place among the British officers. And he inserts Flashmen into the historical narrative in a very clever way. Flashman has a strong dislike of Lord Cardigan. Lord Cardigan is the one who actually led the charge. Now, Lord Cardigan was actually set up way back in the first Flashman novel, when his rivalry with Flashmen was established. And also in the beginning of this novel, his rivalry with Flashmen continues. So he's well established in the Flashman series, and he actually ends up being the one who leads the charge of the Light Brigade. Now, after that whole debacle and after the charge of the Light Brigade, the narrative shifts and Flashman is taken into Russia, where among other things, he records his observations about how horribly the serfs were treated in Russia at the time. Now, again, much of this was absent from my historical education. In traditional history telling, my history education included, I think there's a tendency to focus on the suffering of the kings and the monarchs. So we talk about how miserable it was for Louis XVI, or how tragic it was that Tsar Nicholas II was gunned down. But quite often the history glosses over completely the horrors behind these regimes that led to this resentment. And in this book, we get a full detailing of all the horrible things that the Russian serfs suffered. Now, because it was so horrible, at times I suspected that this book was exaggerating what actually happened. But every time there was an anecdote that I thought was too horrible or too fantastic to be believed, there would be an endnote, and you'd go to the back of the book and check the endnote, and sure enough, it was backed up by a real historical incident. By the way, if you haven't watched my previous videos, this is how these Flashman books work. They're historical fiction, but then there are endnotes in the back that explain the real history behind it. There's also an appearance by one of Lenin's ancestors. So this is way before Lenin was born, but one of his ancestors appeared in the book. Now, his ancestor is loud, boisterous, rabble-rousing, very shouty, not at all like Lenin himself. And fair enough, it's not Lenin himself, it's his ancestor. But I got the impression that the ancestor was supposed to represent Lenin. And that made me a little bit uncomfortable. I had the same reaction in Royal Flash when Karl Marx made a brief appearance. And Karl Marx also appeared as kind of a rabble-rousing soapbox orator type person, when in reality he was much more of an intellectual. Lenin as well. Lenin was much more of a careful planner and schemer. He was a radical, but he wasn't somebody who would fly off the handle shouting and well, I mean, he would, but at political meetings, not just kind of in the streets as this character. So I thought that element of it was a misstep. But putting that aside, I think Fraser does do a good job of describing the conditions of serfdom in Russia. Now, at times, Fraser seems to be drawing a straight line between the horrific conditions of the serfs and the 1917 revolution. I'm not sure that's completely fair, because the serfs actually got freed sometime before the 1917 revolution. So serfdom maybe wasn't a direct cause of the revolution, but maybe it was an indirect cause. Maybe these leftover grievances end up fueling the radicals later. I don't know, I'm not an expert. Still, as I read the book, I couldn't help but remember Dickens' prophecy from A Tale of Two Cities. Now, Dickens in A Tale of Two Cities, when he's describing the excesses of the French regime, says, "Crush humanity out of shape once more, and it will twist itself into the same tortured forms. Sow the same seeds of oppression over again, and it will surely yield the same fruit according to its kind." Now, Dickens published those words back in 1859, when he was warning that oppressive regimes will lead to violent revolutions. And you think, back in 1859, you know, the Russian government could have read those words, and if they had any sense, they could have wised up. But instead, you know, this book describes how horrible and how repressive that regime was, and sure enough, it again led to a very violent and bloody revolution. Okay, back to the book. Also while in Russia, Flashman runs in to Harry Scud East. Now, Harry Scud East had been one of the characters from the original source material, Tom Brown's School Days. And having slogged my way through the original source material, I always like to see these characters from Tom Brown's School Days pop up in the Flashman books. It makes me feel like it was worth my while to have read the original source material. Now, at the end of Tom Brown's School Days, we learn that East, who had been Tom Brown's best friend, and aside from Tom Brown, he's pretty much the other major character in the book. At the end of Tom Brown's School Days, we learn that he is serving in India. Now, apparently there's a sequel to Tom Brown's School Days, which I've not read, called Tom Brown at Oxford, which fleshes out East's career in India more thoroughly, and Fraser references this a bit in his footnotes. Now, I haven't read Tom Brown at Oxford. I don't think I'm going to. I found Tom Brown's School Days enough of a chore to get through. The Scud East in the first part of Tom Brown's School Days is someone with an honest heart and a noble heart, but who has trouble resisting the urge to get into mischief. Now, it may have been more interesting to have this Scud East appear, but Fraser chose instead to portray Scud East, the Christian moralist, which is perhaps a bit of a missed opportunity. At the end of Tom Brown's School Days, we had hints that Scud East and Tom Brown were turning out this way. But the transformation hadn't been completed yet, at least not at the end of Tom Brown's School Days. I don't know what happens in Tom Brown at Oxford. So at the end of Tom Brown's School Days, Scud East is still a little bit mischievous. George Macdonald Fraser takes the Scud East and just makes him into a hardcore Christian moralist instead, which maybe is a bit of a missed opportunity, but on the other hand, it makes him a perfect Victorian-era foil for Flashmen. East's strong sense of duty and self-sacrifice in this book contrast perfectly with Flashman, who is only concerned about saving his own skin. There's a part in this book when East suggests to Flashmen that they risk their lives to save the British Empire. And Flashman narrates in an aside to the reader. He says, "Do you know, when a man talks like that to me, I feel downright insulted. Why other unnamed lives, or the East India Company's dividend, or the credit of Lord Aberdeen, or the honor of British arms should be held by me to be of greater consequence than my own shrinking skin, I've always been at a loss to understand." Well, that's just classic Flashman right there. Flashmen and East stumble onto a Russian plan to invade Afghanistan and India and take them from the British. Now, once again, I thought, okay, this is really far-fetched. She's got to be making this up. But once again, it's all backed up in the endnotes. Apparently, there was really such a plan put forth to the Tsar. And according to the endnotes, these proposals were considered seriously by the Russian government at one point. And then finally, in the last part of the book, Flashman ends up in Central Asia. And here, the author George Macdonald Fraser digs up long-forgotten historical characters for Flashmen to interact with, such as Yaqub Beg and Izek Kutabar, who led the local indigenous resistance against the Russian Empire and its drive south in the 19th century. And as with everything else, the story is backed up with endnotes describing the ruthless Russian march south and the local people who were brutally subdued in this campaign. Flashman finds himself joining the local tribes and their Chinese allies and helping them fight against the Russians. There are obscure works on Central Asia by anonymous surveyors and military writers, Flashman the narrator says, and I can look in them and find the names and places. Yaqub Beg, Itsik Kutbar, Katitora, Busuk Khan, and the 7 Khojas, the great and middle hordes of the Black Sands, and the Golden Road, the sky-blue wolves of the hungry steppe, Sahib Kam, and the remarkable girl they called the Silk One. You can trace them all if you're curious, and learn how in those days they fought the Russians inch by inch, from the Jakartas to the Oxus. And if it reads like a mixture of Robin Hood and the Arabian Nights, well, I was there for part of it, and even I look back on it as some kind of frightening fairy tale come true. End quote. So, to sum up, it's a fascinating Victorian-era adventure story with just the right mix of satire, comedy, and travelogue. Definitely worth checking out.